So thanks, Alex. So this is a great opportunity and one of the more packed rooms that I've been in for one of these talks. So that's going to be a fun dialogue. This is based on a project that really develops a bunch of quite detailed policy proposals that Eric Posner and I have been developing over recent years. But especially this being a philosophy seminar, I want to start not with the details of these policy proposals, though I will get into one of them, but with the broader social vision that we're trying to convey. Because I think in some ways that's the most important part of the book. It's trying to break up the standard modes of political discourse. And as such, I want, for the moment, for you to suspend some of your practical concerns and come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictive city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So Marketopia is a bit like Zootopia, except rather than its leading characteristic being the diverse mammals that inhabit it, it's the fact that, let's put aside for the moment personal effects like, heirlooms and pets and so forth, but all the major private property in Marketopia, the houses and land and airplanes and factories and so forth, all are continually up for auction to the highest bidder. And that highest bidder can possess that asset so long as A, she pays that highest bid as a monthly, let's say, rental payment to a common pool, and B, she stands ready to turn that asset over to anyone who beats that highest bid. And second, the public assets, things like where the buses run and where the parks are located and who governs Marketopia, are also going to be decided on by a process like this, except rather than being allocated to the highest bidder, we're going to add up the total bids of everyone who prefers one option or the other and allocate it to the greatest total bid. And all the money that's raised in this auction is continually refunded to every citizen of Marketopia in equal shares, as a social dividend, you might call it, that's what we prefer to call it, or universal basic income, or sort of the same thing as what they basically do in Norway and Alaska with all the oil revenue that they raise. Use it to fund public goods or to give a dividend to the citizens. So, on the one hand, you're probably thinking about Marketopia when you first hear of it, that this is sort of like the most extreme version of a free market you can possibly imagine. It's sort of more extreme than even the greatest fever dreams of Adam Smith, right? Because people say we live in a market society, right? But you actually realize when you reflect on Marketopia that in fact most major assets are not up for some sort of competitive bidding process. It's not like there's just a going price that's reasonably competitive on most things. If I wanted to buy this building and do something much more sensible than have philosophy seminars in it, I would have to go to the London School of Economics and engage in some long, complex bargaining process with them. And as soon as they knew that I was interested, they would probably try to hold me take me to the cleaners for everything I was worth once they thought that I was interested in an asset like this. Whereas in Marketopia, everything is continually up for bid. Now, that's kind of interesting. It makes you realize that most assets are not part of a market. Most are controlled by some central, powerful authority or wealthy individual. But you might not think that moving beyond that is a good thing. In fact, you might think, well, in Marketopia, the wealthy are going to dominate everything even more completely because they're going to be the ones who have the assets that allow them, the money that allows them to outbid everyone else in society for control of these assets. But then you have to ask yourself, well, what do you mean by wealthy, right? To be wealthy means to have wealth. It means to have stocks and bonds and businesses. and land and other forms of wealth. Whereas in Marketopia, all those things are commonly owned, and they're all continually returned to the citizens in equal proportions by the rules of the game, and every citizen, by the rules of the game, has an equal right to use that revenue that's returned to contest for control of these assets. So in some sense, Marketopia is actually the most thoroughgoing implementation of the principle of common ownership advocated by this birthday boy here, rather than dominated by the wealthy. In fact, it's much more thoroughgoing than most real-world forms of socialism have been, because those have ended up actually being dominated, usually, by some bureaucratic elite, which ends up, in many cases, tyrannizing over their fellow citizens more completely than did the capitalist oppressors that they claim to replace. So this seems kind of like a little bit of a paradox. How can the most extreme version of a market society also be the most extreme implementation of the principle of common ownership or sort of socialism of some sort? Now that sounds strange to us who grew up in the Cold War and post-Cold War periods, because the assumption of those periods was that there was this opposition between capitalism and communism or socialism. But prior to that, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the leaders of the field of political economy, people like Leon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, who founded the Marginal Revolution and were central to the field of political economy, which gave birth to economics and politics and sociology. They actually thought this was, sort of a central dogma of the field at the time. And in fact, it was most closely associated with someone who was actually, for a period, much more influential than either of these individuals. Can anyone identify this person who hasn't read the book? Henry George. That's Henry George, right?
I don't know what he looked like, but he's sounding like
so Henry George was the best-selling author in the English language, other than the Bible, for about 30 years. He was, his book was the namesake of the, arguably the namesake of the American progressive movement. He inspired British politics quite profoundly, including Winston Churchill and the People's Budget of 1909, and probably an order of magnitude fewer of you recognize him than recognize the people on the previous slide, to a large extent because his ideas were sort of lost in the left-right debates of the Cold War. But the project of this book is to try to revive his philosophy, or some of the elements of his philosophy, which, while they were lost in the Cold War, ended up becoming the foundation for a field called mechanism design, which is now won a couple of Nobel Prizes, but rather than being applied to its original goals of transforming social institutions, has instead mostly been applied to doing things like pricing the search terms on the right-hand side of your Google page, or allocating ad space on Facebook. But we don't think that's what it was meant for originally. We think it was meant to transform our social institutions, and we're going to try to bring that out with a series of proposals that I think illustrate how we could build this into a social philosophy that offers a really different approach to the leading crises of our time than are currently on the table. So what are those crises that are motivating us? Well, the first is the dramatic rise in inequality within wealthy countries, especially Anglo-Saxon countries. So this comes from Piketty and Siaz's study in the United States, and it shows that the share of income accruing to the top 0.1 and 1% of the income distribution has roughly doubled since the trough in the 1970s until today. And at the same time, we've seen a dramatic decline in the share of income allocated to all workers. So this is called the labor share of income, and the remainder of it is a complicated object, as Simca in the audience has pointed out, but it roughly goes to very wealthy individuals. And you might not be so worried about this trend if you believe in the rhetoric of people like, Milton Friedman, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, who said, look, let's accept some more inequality, because that's the price of having a more dynamic, more quickly growing society. Let's lower taxes, and we'll get faster growth and more innovation and so forth. But, I think the thing that this sort of missed, and which has become increasingly salient recently, is that government isn't the only institution that can extract taxes. Taxes can also be extracted by monopoly power. And one measure of the tax that monopolies impose on the economy is something called the markup. And this is more than tripled since the 1970s until recently. It's now something like 70% markup on average in the economy, which is much larger than the share of income that governments take in taxes. And to sort of show you how this has evolved along with the labor share, I've inversely plotted this markup in gold along with the labor share. And you see, in this recent period, we've seen this dramatic decline in the labor share as we've seen a dramatic increase in this market power tax on the economy. And if, in fact, we follow the standard, Reagan-Thatcher logic, and we think taxes really reduce growth, but we take into account the fact they can be extracted by monopolies as well as by governments, we should expect to see a dramatic fall rather than an increase in the growth rates over this period. And in fact, that's exactly what we've seen throughout the wealthy world. The United States is actually the least extreme example. Their growth rates have only fallen roughly in half from the 30 years following the end of World War II till the most recent 30 years. But in other countries, they've fallen far more dramatically. This shows what's happened in the United Kingdom in recent years. And this combination of stagnation and inequality, rising inequality, I think is discrediting the neoliberal consensus in the way that stagflation discredited the Keynesian consensus in the 1970s. It sort of goes against the central trade-off that these ideas suggest would exist. And in fact, we gave it a name associated with that. We call it stagnequality. And yes, I know it's a very ugly word, but it's a uglier phenomenon. So the combination of the discrediting of economic technocracy, economic expertise created by this stagnequality, and a growing discrediting of political expertise, I think, is really causing a crisis in developed countries. So what do I mean by political expertise? Increasingly within wealthy countries, we've been trying to resolve the conflicts between minorities and majorities by constricting democracy and increasingly allocating responsibility for resolving those conflicts, whether they be between the minorities that are defended by the right, such as the wealthy and gun owners and the deeply religious, or the minorities defended by the left, whether the ethno-racial minorities, the sexual minorities, immigrants, etc. We've increasingly been defending their interests by allocating more and more power to judges, in the United States especially, and to supranational bodies in Europe. Supranational bodies with limited democratic accountability, and that's increasingly given rise to populist movements of both the left and the right that object to these restrictions on democracy, that object to supranational bodies, both that defend the interests, say, of capital and the interests of minorities. And you've seen that in the rise of Donald Trump and Brexit, but also on the left in the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders in the United States. And while we think that these movements are right to object to the ways in which democracy is being eroded, to object to the failures of economic policy to bring about equality and growth, we don't think they really have solutions to those problems. We're not sure that they even think that they have solutions to those problems. And certainly the things that they advocate don't take advantage of the opportunities that technology and globalization and greater diversity of our cultures offer to us. Instead, they want to sort of retreat to some version of an idealized vision of, say, the 1950s, whether that be the state socialism of the 1950s or the closed cultures and societies of the 1950s. And we want to instead propose a vision that leans into those possibilities, that tries to harness them to address the challenges that we face. So I want to try to put some more flesh on that vision, not by necessarily going into what I think is the most interesting or important of our proposals, but into the one that I think most clearly breaks up existing lines of political debate, which is an alternative to private property that we want to offer. I'll then very briefly talk about the other proposals and tie these together into a broader social vision and talk about what this means going forward. Okay, so what we want to try to break up is this standard discourse that sees on the one hand central planning, and on the other hand sort of a dynamic decentralized capitalism as the main alternatives to in social life. And in particular, we want to revive a tradition which instead says that both of these are really just two aspects of the same phenomenon, which is the concentration of power and authority in a small number of hands, whether those be the hands of a central planner or those be the hands of the wealthy and capitalistic corporations. And instead seeks to establish rules of the game that will inherently decentralize authority within a wider public. And this was the philosophy of Henry George. In particular, he argued that the greatest source, at least in his time, of this sort of unjust concentration of power was the control over land. So he argued that land is created by God, and that humans can at best occupy the land temporarily, but can never have a right to truly possess it because they didn't create it. And that we should have 100% tax on the value of land, which should be redistributed among citizens in equal shares, because if we allow private ownership over land, not only does it lead to an unjust inequality in the distribution of society's resources, but also private ownership of land gives effectively a monopoly to a small number of people to use land in ways that may well not be its best use. And that if we tax away that value, we force those people to either make productive use of that land or to pass it on at competitive rates to those who can make best use of it. So Henry George was enormously influential. As I mentioned, the 1909 People's Budget, for which Winston Churchill made his initial political career campaigning, and which has some very funny songs associated with it. I recommend listening to some of the Georgist hymns that were sung in support of the People's Budget, like The Land and Off of the Land, Land Monopoly Must Clear. He had a huge influence on popular culture for a period. So this was a vacant lot in New York City where a billboard was taken out by a Georgist, and it says, "Everybody works but the vacant lot. I paid $3,600 for this lot and will hold it till I get $6,000. The profit is an unearned increment made possible by the presence of this community and the enterprise of its people. I take the profit without earning it. For the remedy, read Henry George." Now, Henry George's greatest cultural contribution was this. Can anyone recognize what this is?
Monopolies.
Except it's not. It is, in fact, the landlord's game. And only one of its set of rules, and the whole point was to contrast the two sets of rules, was the monopoly set of rules, which has led to the game that you are all familiar with. The other set of rules, the progressive rules, were ones in which the rents on the land paid into the public treasury, used then to buy out from the private owners the public utilities, and then the railroads so that they could be run freely for the public benefit, and then eventually to pay a social dividend which accrued to everyone who passed this spot, which you now know as Go.
So how do you win?
Well, that's kind of the point, Alex. So what ends up happening in the game is that, of course, in Monopoly, someone ends up with everything, right? Whereas in this, like, everyone's sort of trying to accomplish that, but it's kind of impossible.
That's no fun.
And so that's what ends up happening. It's sort of what happens is, like, the harder you try to, like, put other people out, actually the more that things get developed, and the more that gets paid to the public treasury, the more that gets refunded back to everyone. So, okay, so Henry George, I think, has a lot to teach us all, but unfortunately there were some significant weaknesses, or maybe you could say lack of understanding of the richness of the world that showed up in Henry George's ideas. So, in particular, he made a very sharp distinction between the land, which belonged to everyone in common, and labor, or any products of labor, anything that was made by people, which belonged entirely to the person who created it, and that, sort of never the twain shall meet in his world. But the problem is that's a pretty artificial distinction. So let me give you an example, and I'll use Alex as our prototypical monopolist here, because he seems to relish that role. Suppose that Vincent van Gogh makes a painting, and just before committing suicide dumps it into a dumpster somewhere, which by some quirk of fate ends up in the possession of Alex, who discovers it, dusts it off, and puts it up in his apartment, and then says to the Museum of Modern Art, well, if you'll give me $1 billion for this crucial element of Van Gogh's oeuvre, I'd be willing to turn it over to the public so people can enjoy it more broadly. Maybe that bargaining breaks down and it ends up sitting for years in Alex's apartment, or perhaps he ends up a billionaire for no good reason. But in either case, it's really no different than the story that George told about land, even though that's a product of human effort. And in fact, as you start to reflect on it, you might come to think that actually many forms of wealth that we're accustomed to in society are something a bit like this. The financial speculator who gets information about something that's going to be a major change in the public markets a bit earlier than the rest of society without running afoul of insider trading laws, but just has, finds something that nobody else saw, but that everyone else would have discovered a few hours later. For an example of that, see the movie Margin Call. It's a great illustration of that. Or the coder in a dorm room at Harvard who realizes a little bit ahead of everybody else that social networking is going to be a big thing and ends up owning a big piece of land, which is called Facebook, right? And all of these are in some sense not land literally defined, but they are land in the sense that George intended it.
Well,
and they, yeah, absolutely.
What about not the product of human effort, but human effort itself? I mean, do I get to bid to have Glen intelligence for a month?
Not in the scheme that we're going to propose, because there's a matching issue in that. So, like, when I work for you, it creates some utility for me as well as for you, because it depends on what sort of a master you are, what task you put me to work on. And for that reason, the price doesn't fully reflect the nature of the demand being made upon me.
You can bid for, I can bid for it. I mean, it seems formula to distinguish between land on the one hand and the product of Glenwell's intelligence and Glenwell's intelligence itself. I just want to have your intelligence for any purpose, whatever, for the next month, and I'm willing to bid a lot.
The difference that I'm drawing is that, and I'm not saying that there's a 100% distinction between these, but I think that when you work, it's extremely important who you work for and under what conditions. And when you sell something to someone, it's generally not that important the precise way in which they end up using it conditional on them having purchased it from you. I'm not saying that you never care at all about that, but as a qualitative matter, I would say it's much more important in the labor case one thing versus the
All these
other.
differences are reflected in the auction. I mean, the capital scheme is...
Let me explain. I agree, some version of an auction might be able to account for that, but we have not yet been able to come up with one that we feel satisfied with as being practically relevant, that incorporates this two-sided nature of the relationship. And we discuss in the conclusion the challenges of coming up with that, but in principle, I don't, as a matter of principle, like have a belief in self-ownership that would lead me to think that that shouldn't be extended in that direction. It's just that we haven't figured out a way that we think is plausible. And this is a book that's about making real proposals for the real world, not about thought experiments. So, yeah.
Just a quick question for Mike. So how do you, are you going to address how you strategy proof this? Because I'm just thinking about the fact that right now, when we think about patents and a lot of other informational technology, quite often people use ownership rights so as to prevent things from being done, which you could argue is a detriment to the common good. And I'm worried about that problem becoming much worse here, where if everything is up for auction, how do you know that people won't buy things up for kind of disadvantageous uses for the common good, simply because it's in my strategic interest to make sure that you don't do something?
So there certainly can be what I would call anti-competitive motives that can arise in terms of the use of the assets that can make them actually more valuable, but less. So to the extent there's literally anti-competitive motives and you're trying to sort of stop something from competing with your product, that can arise in this environment, and you have to rely on antitrust policy to deal with that, and on the average, it to be the case that despite the fact that there will be some anti-competitive things that arise, that on average, assets being used in their most, efficient, quote-unquote, way, on average, it enhances things, at least subject to the antitrust protections that exist. I mean, look, a bunch of the book is about antitrust and all the things we should do there, and I would advocate those things and so forth. But I would still say that on average, I would still unilaterally advocate this proposal because, for example, look, capitalism led to the assembly of a lot of assets, right? And those were monopolistic, and that was harmful and so forth. But, on average, I think that the ability to reallocate assets was on net beneficial, even though it also led to market power.
Can I ask a really quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Doesn't that then just tip the balance of power from the monopolist in the case of capitalism, from the central planner in the case of communists, to then the judges who actually interpret and enforce antitrust policy?
No, because I think that the antitrust rules that we're going to advocate are quite simple and transparent. And actually, I'm not a big fan of discretionary antitrust interventions. I basically think antitrust should mostly focus on stopping the exercise of horizontal market power by things like mergers, which would catch the example that you gave, but it wouldn't catch lots of discretionary, interventions. But I just don't think that's the appropriate scope of antitrust policy. I think that should be covered by other interventions. So, yeah, Christian.
It's another quick follow-up. So in current market arrangements, we always have criteria specifying which goods are appropriate goods for market transactions and which goods are not. So let's say in many places or most places, a market in kidneys or so is not permitted. It would seem that likewise under this system we would need to have some criteria to specify which goods are appropriate goods for transactions in this common pool and which are not. Can we say something systematic about that?
I have nothing to say about that within the scope of the book. I would apply whatever rules currently prevail on that matter, and it would only be goods that are currently marketed that would be subject to the policy that I have yet to describe. But yes, I would not change that scope as part of this proposal. That doesn't mean I'm not open to changes in that scope, nor that in this world we might not then want to re-examine the scope. But there's nothing in the proposal I'm going to make which affects that scope condition. And that is the last question I'm going to take until I get a question from someone who is not a white male professor over the age of 30. So,
I also think we should let you move on to actually describe your proposal.
Okay. So George inspired lots of things. One thing that he inspired was this individual. Does anyone know who this is? Yeah, say it. Someone just whispered it.
Sun Yat-sen?
That's Sun Yat-sen. Yes, exactly. So Sun Yat-sen sort of had the same relationship to George that Lenin had to Marx. And I think if Sun Yat-sen had managed to keep control of China for a bit longer, we may well have ended up with a debate between Georgism and capitalism during the 20th century rather than between capitalism and communism. But I think probably for the worse for the century, he did not manage to, and instead of Georgist ideas spreading to Russia, communist ideas spread to China. But because Sen didn't manage to actually stay in power, he had more time to write and think, and came up with quite a creative idea for overcoming another problem with George's ideas, which was how do you figure out what the value of the assets are that you're then going to charge this price on? Which was, he said, allow everyone to assess their own value for the asset, but then allow the government to take the asset if the person assesses a low value. So that would give someone an incentive to keep the value high. Now, when some of the forces that were inspired by Sun, those led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan, they actually implemented this system. But because of the spirit of Georgism sort of getting submerged in the capitalist communist debate, of which Chiang Kai-shek was an active participant, the government that he led ended up largely favoring landowners, allowing them to assess low values and not taking the land away from them. So they did lip service, but not a very serious implementation of Sun's ideas. But this individual had a very creative idea. This is Arnold Harberger, about how to address this general sort of a problem in countries where there's this issue of corruption, where the government wouldn't end up enforcing property rights. And together with Anthony Lee Zhang, we rediscovered this idea, which was put forward by Harberger originally as part of his mission to Chile from the University of Chicago, which became infamous, as many of you will be aware. But this was actually proposed under the Democratic center-left government, where his mission started in the early 1960s. And here's what he wrote. I'll let him describe it in his own words, but it's the basis of our common ownership self-assessed tax, which is the actual proposal that Christian was alluding to. So it says, if you have to make a base for taxes, adopt criteria that determine the true economic value. The solution that the economist offers is simple and direct. Allow the owner to declare the value himself, make the values public, and oblige the owner to sell his property to any person willing to pay the declared value. The system is simple and creates incentives even beyond those existing in markets for assets to be employed in their most productive economic use. So let me give you an illustration of what this would be like from the spectrum. So here is a nice illustration by one of my artist friends, Mary Ellen Carroll, of the state of the spectrum in a particular locality in the United States, graphed by ownership rights being every one of these blocks, the horizontal axis being the frequency, and the vertical axis being a one-dimensional collapsing of spatial location. And so what you see is the spectrum is quite fragmented. If you wanted to get a block that was sort of rectangular, which is what's actually necessary to implement 5G and Wi-Fi services, which are hopefully the forward-looking uses of the spectrum, you'd have to buy up some rectangle within this broader space. But that's very hard to do. There's 1,000 little owners of these individual plots, and it's very hard to get control that you would need to own the relevant parts of the spectrum. So, what might we do? Well, suppose that everyone were required to post a price that they were willing to accept for the sale of their asset, and they could change that price at any time. But then they'd have to pay a tax, let's say 7% tax rate. We're going to argue that that's roughly optimal on average across the economy. So a 7% tax rate on the average amount that they assessed. I tried to change this number here, but I think that the new slides didn't come through, unfortunately. But anyway, so this would be 7% of 25 million, which is $1,750,000 for that year. But this would not just be true of that particular piece of spectrum, it would be true of every one of these bits of spectrum, which would mean that if you were Verizon coming in trying to offer this new 5G service, you could just circle some collection of spectrum and say, look, I want to buy that. And you'd immediately be told that that would be $82.3 million. And then once you buy it up, you would now be able to make a much higher value use of this rectangular block, though you wouldn't really need this extra bit that was left over. So you'd take this, you'd assess $1 billion on it, and then you'd leave the rest of this for someone else to buy. Okay, so let me just more explicitly describe what I mean by this system. So one thing you noticed is that the current possessor gets to choose the way in which the assets that that possessor owns are bundled. They could put them together and then hive off some other chunk that they didn't need as much, etc. This would apply to all assets eventually, though we would start with the assets that are most disproportionately owned by the wealthy, things like administrative property, spectrum, intellectual property, move towards commercial assets, then move towards things that are more real estate, but more commercial real estate, to second homes, and eventually to first homes, and maybe eventually to personal property as well. People, for assets that have a good reason why it would take you a while to move out effectively, there would be a statutory time to vacate, the same way that with evictions or foreclosures, there's a statutory time to vacate. Yes?
This is probably an obvious issue, but
Yeah.
this seems like it could be really bad for people that own property and have owned property for a long time in gentrifying neighborhoods. It seems to put them in a real bind where either they have to pay a tax rate that they can't afford.
I'm going to go through a representative calculation like that, so then you can see whether you think that's true in a moment. I don't think you will, but
So I'm thinking either.
I don't think you'll think that's true if you see my representative calculation
Okay, fair
in a
enough.
moment.
Okay.
So if you still think that's true, let's discuss it more then. Okay. So the turnover rate associated, so the different assets would be taxed at different rates according to two rough considerations. One is that the tax rate should be roughly proportional to the turnover rate of that asset in the market. Why is that? The incentive that you have to set like a monopoly price on your asset to try to hold it away from other people is proportional to the chance that someone's going to buy it from you, because that's the probability with which you get that higher price. You'd want that to be balanced roughly by the tax rate, because that's what discourages you from setting a higher price. So you want those things to be roughly in proportion to each other. So roughly you want the tax rate to track along with assets that turn over more frequently. You want to have a higher tax rate. Assets that turn over less frequently, you want to have a lower tax rate. On the other hand, you also want to give people an incentive to invest and take care of assets. This is like the labor versus land distinction that George talked about. So the assets that require more investment and more care should have a lower tax rate. So assets should be taxed at roughly their turnover rate if they are not very investment intensive, and somewhat less than that if they're very investment intensive. We would allow people to deduct liabilities and mortgages from this thing, so it would be a tax on the net equity that you own, and that's where I'm going to come back to your point. Technology would play an important role in this, both in allowing people to view the ledger and choose which things they want to buy, but also in helping people price the assets, both by figuring out what are alternative assets that they could possibly own if they end up having to move, so that helps them figure out what the asset that they have right now is worth, but also helping them, just in an automated way, figure that out and help them set a price. And on average, we think that this rate would be about 7% in the economy overall, which would, because it's a tax not on the income, but on the capital itself, is actually a very high tax rate. It would expropriate about 2/3 of the value of private wealth. We would use half of that to eliminate other taxes on capital and to pay down national debts so as to encourage investment. And then the other half would be used to fund collective goods and or pay a social dividend in an egalitarian manner across citizens.
I think it's safe to open the window now, because I think
It's getting a little hot.
the noise has stopped, so we're going to give that a shot, if you don't mind.
Are there implications in the
Yeah.
system for incorporating negative externalities, or is the main collective choice problem more equal distribution of wealth for the social dividend?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think that there is some minor direct ways in which negative externalities, positive externalities could be just diffusely incorporated through the system. So like, for example, one externality that we really don't try to internalize within cities is the fact that if I beautify my house, it benefits the values of my neighbors' houses. This would, to some extent, mitigate that, because we suggest in the book that 1/4 of the revenue would be at the municipal level, 1/4 would be at the provincial level, 1/4 at the state level, and 1/4 at the national level, 1/4 at the global level. So that would start to somewhat internalize this externality, but not in a very strong way. We would mostly govern externalities through quadratic voting, which is another one of the chapters of the book, and I'll briefly talk about it in a bit. So it doesn't very strongly deal with this.
In terms of like
issues.
issues of environmentalism versus efficient use of capital.
Well, there actually is some amount that you could potentially do that, because people could potentially, if there are individual specific harms associated with those things, which I would only think about for a more localized pollution because it's too weird for climate change, but you could potentially ask people to like self-assess things that are currently valued by the statistical value of human life. So that would allow them to like sort of price out the cost of having pollution in their community, but pay some, tax on that or something like that. So it would be self-revealing.
You would have to somehow make people put their money where their mouth is.
But I think that would be a relatively limited scope of things that it would make sense to treat that way. But it's potentially a tool there. But the focus of this proposal itself is on the ownership of capital. Okay, so what are the benefits associated with this? And then I'll turn to my representative calculation. So before I get to the redistributive aspect of it, which is a large part of it, I just want to talk about pure efficiency benefits associated with this. And because it's a little bit more academic audience, I'll put an academic name on these things as well as describing informally what they are. So suppose that Lucy wants to buy this water jug off of me, which I've now declared myself to be the owner of. If she makes me an offer, she's not going to offer me the full amount that she's willing to pay for that mug, and nor am I going to counter with the minimum that I'd be willing to accept for it. We're both going to try to get a share of the benefit that the other gains from the transaction, and to the extent that we're doing that, we are going to occasionally not fully read the other's intentions, and therefore fail to come to a bargain, or waste so much time in the process of trying to divine each other's intentions, and so much effort in trying to figure it out, that we will have lost a significant fraction of the benefit associated with the potential transaction. That's called the Meyerson-Satterthwaite theorem. But there's also another thing that goes on in bargaining, which is not just that I'm trying to figure out what Lucy values the thing at, but I'm trying to convince her that I value it a lot, because if I value it a lot, then maybe she would value it a lot as well. So I tend to strike an aggressive bargaining position, not simply because I want to exploit the other person, but because I want to convince them that they should be willing to pay more for it as well. And both of these things manifest not just in sort of the rational ways that people navigate bargaining, but also irrationally through effects like the endowment effect, where if you tell someone that they own something, even with nothing else, they tend to attach a higher value to that asset. And I think that's there's actually a lot of evidence suggesting that's to a large extent just a sort of heuristic way of doing these two bargaining things, that people, are much more effective if they convince themselves of something to convince someone else of it, so they have this attachment to themselves. That doesn't happen when people are renters. In fact, the opposite happens when people are renters. They actually undervalue the asset because they now know that that might affect the price that they might have to pay in rent. So that would be balanced out under this system, and so you wouldn't have that impediment to trade either. But often an important impediment to trade is just some mixture of sort of laziness, malice, and sort of just pride of holding on to things, and that would become very expensive to exercise in this setting, and so would be discouraged. And maybe most importantly, this is what John Hicks, another Nobel laureate, actually called the best of all monopoly rents is the quiet life. This would stop people from having that quiet life of sitting on the monopoly rents associated with ownership of a large amount of wealth. But probably most important is the fact that the value of all assets would fall by 2/3 once people took into account the fact that they'd have to pay all these taxes. And that's roughly reducing the value of an asset to roughly what its down payment would be at present. So that means that there would be far less of a role for debt and credit in this economy, which would have a variety of macroeconomic implications, but also just make it easier for entrepreneurs to access assets and for people to access ownership of a home. And finally, it would be massively redistributive. So let me give an example for this illustrated by the typical situation of a U.S. Median household. So a U.S. median household is roughly $60,000 of home equity and about $25,000 of other assets, whereas the mean U.S. household has roughly $1 million of net assets. Now these would fall by 2/3 under this system to, this is a little bit off, again the slides have been updated, but $28,000 and $320,000 respectively, which would mean that if the individual valued their assets at current market values, they would be paying about $2,000 in taxes and $22,500 they would receive as a social dividend, and so they would on net receive about $20,500 in social dividend. Now you might say, suppose this person really loves their house, they really don't want to move out. So let's say they overvalue their assets by 5x, right? They would still receive about $13,000 in a social dividend on net. So the very wealthy, if they overvalued their things by 5x, yes, might be forced to move out of their houses, but anyone even remotely close to the position of a median household would never be put in that situation. You know, roughly the, so I'll repeat your question in one second. You know, you might initially think this is going to really reduce the stability that most people have. But I think that the misimpression that people have is that most people have a lot of stability. That's not true. Most people are subject to eviction with quite a significant probability because they live in rentals. Or they own a home that goes underwater, either figuratively, because of debt, or literally because they live in places that are prone to natural disasters. And in our society, wealth buys stability. Very predictably, wealth buys stability. There's a huge literature in sociology on that. The difference in this society is, yes, you can still purchase stability. In fact, you have to purchase stability. Not because of others in society, but simply because of Mother Nature and all sorts of factors that will cause your life to be unstable if you don't purchase stability. The difference is that everyone in this society can afford to purchase stability because we tax the way in which the stability of the wealthy hoards assets away from offering opportunities to other people in society. Whereas at present, we allow that hoarding to just be a negative externality on the rest of us rather than being borne by the people who create it. Yeah?
It's not clear to me what the overall goal is of all these proposals and how we are to evaluate them.
Yeah.
So you had 7 benefits and you're giving a calculation. How should we evaluate your proposals?
By the net benefit associated with them under your ethical system. I can give you a utilitarian calculation about that if you want, but there's non-utilitarian ways to think about it. For example, I think this dramatically reduces the domination of certain sort of central nodes in society over people who are unwilling acceptors of that domination. But there, you know, there's other ethical calculus.
So it seems like what you're suggesting though doesn't provide the calculation that you want. Right? This is so parts of it. This is a static calculation.
No, it's very much a dynamic calculation. It's actually, none of it would make any sense if it was a static calculation, because you could just hold an auction and everything would be fine then if it was static. Whereas the whole point here is that there's constantly evolving uses of assets, and you can't, even by any sort of an auction, as for example, like Ronald Dworkin would propose, achieve this thing. It's fundamental to the nature of private property, that in order to have innovation, you need to have it be reallocated to new uses.
So if you compare where we are to 1970, all of the benefits come from growth and not from redistribution. The negatives of redistribution you have in mind are swamped by anything having to do with growth. And then your criteria should be what makes us grow more.
Well, and that's what I talked about on the top 5 items before the 6th one.
Those are reallocation. Who should own the asset? What's the marginal benefit?
Well, yeah, and that's, I think, what goes on in most of growth. It has to do with moving things from old uses to new uses. And that would be greatly facilitated by this process. You know, in Israel, for example, they've had a far better development of 5G and Wi-Fi relative to the US because they hadn't auctioned off as much of the radio spectrum. They were able to reallocate it to these new uses much more easily. Whereas in the US, we have been basically stuck for 7 years. They haven't been able to do 5G and WiMAX, which was like blanketing a city in Wi-Fi, because everything was held on to by these over-the-air broadcasters of various sorts, which were not using it very efficiently. And I think that the engine of growth in capitalism has not been private property. Private property was protected perfectly well under feudalism. You got all the benefits of that asset, probably maybe even more strongly than under capitalism. What capitalism allowed for was more flexible reallocation of those assets. But it didn't do that as well as it could if you had a true free market, which is what we're trying to create. I'm going to honor my rule again, so I will wait for one more broader question before I take another question. Okay, so this sounds a bit pie in the sky. Obviously, it sounds like we're changing our most fundamental social institutions, but there are many near-term, largely uncontroversial applications of this idea, I think, that we are actively pursuing that I think are likely to be implemented in the coming years. So jointly with Paul Milgram, who designed the original spectrum auctions, and then designed these reallocation auctions, which were such a pain in the butt, he came to the conclusion that this is just not at all feasible to actually try to get spectrum reallocated this way on a regular basis. So he's advocating for the new spectrum that they write into the rules of it a process like this. And we wrote a piece with him on this for a magazine, a regulation magazine. We're also talking to the UK government about the possibility of using this for natural resource leases, like drilling in the North Sea. And probably in the nearest term, the thing that's most exciting is within the blockchain community, there's a lot of interest in these ideas because on the one hand, they really believe in markets, but on the other hand, they really want to stop inequality from assembling or things from being overly rigid. So I've been working a lot recently with Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, on using this as a way to do domain name allocation and possibly other digital asset ownership within the Ethereum blockchain. We actually wrote a manifesto on Monday on Medium called Liberation Through Radical Decentralization. But even though these are the near-term uses that we want to do, eventually we want to see this applied much more broadly, eventually even to things that might sound a bit uncomfortable, like personal property. And the reason is that we actually think this could help overcome many of the social criticisms of capitalism. In particular, among them are the excessive devotion that people have constantly been said to have under capitalism to material possessions rather than the investments they make in the communities and the people around them. Because in this system, rather than my property belonging to me and me getting all the benefits of it and me not really caring very much about other people around my property, instead, in this system, everything would sort of be much more accessible to me. And on the other hand, I would get the benefits from the social dividend of the things around me. So there would be much more of a fluidity in the society, much more of an openness to opportunities and to experiences rather than attachment to physical long-term possessions. And in fact, I think this is quite consistent with things that are already starting to go on with my generation, where people are, using Airbnb, using other sharing services, and I even met a graduate student at Northwestern who has, after reading Marie Kondo's book on the magical art of, or the life-changing magic of tidying up, she says, you should touch objects and say, does this give me joy or not? And throw it out if it doesn't give me joy. Well, she implemented a more continuous version of that, which is that she said, how much joy does this object give me? And then she listed everything on eBay at her willingness to accept for it. And so now she has an automated process of society cleaning out her apartment by people picking things off on eBay and her shipping them to them. I think that that's actually quite an interesting direction that I think people are thinking about going in. And it not only helps address those problems of capitalism, it also helps address another, I think, one of the most persistent criticisms of capitalism, which is that it sort of encourages an exploitative individualism and people to constantly be looking to take advantage of each other. And I think the reason many of us have that impression is in most major commercial interactions we have, we don't operate under a principle of perfect competition. And we're constantly spending a huge amount of often very stressful time trying to make sure that we're not getting cheated by the person that we're in a negotiation with. In this society, that would be far less frequent and far less important because every asset would have a liquid price on it that would be at or a bit above the person's willingness to accept. So everything would be a mutually beneficial exchange that we would end up having with someone rather than having this dominance of this sort of unpleasant and exploitative commercial interaction. I think I'm gonna still wait. Okay, so that's the first chapter of the book.
Now, I'm just going to
yeah.
let you know that unless you pay us a lot of money for your time, you've got another 7 minutes before we open it up to open.
That's perfect.
Yes?
Excellent. Yeah. So the second idea is trying to extend this auction concept to collective decision making and public goods. And the way that we do that is we have a system called quadratic voting, where everybody is allocated an equal share of voice credits that they can use to defend their most sacred interests rather than leaving it to judges or the European Court of Justice to defend that. That happens through the system we call quadratic voting. Oh, oops. I can't really make this work. Okay, that's fine. Well, I was going to show you. You'll have to take it for granted, take my word for it, but this might sound like really hard, like how are people going to know about the quadratic function? So that's the way that the system works. You can put more votes on something, and it becomes increasingly costly according to the quadratic rule to put more votes on that issue so people don't concentrate all their votes on one issue. And that sounds really abstract, but actually we have a really nice user interface where in some ways actually people without too much education navigate it better, because people with a lot of education try to form a whole plan of how they're going to use it and just execute, whereas other people navigate it and they sort of run into constraints and they sort of learn the nature of the constraints experientially. The third proposal is a new system for migration where we try to channel the benefits of migration rather than to just the people who migrate and the relatively wealthy people who employ them. Instead, they would be channeled to every citizen within wealthy countries by giving every citizen an equal right to sponsor migrants and to negotiate with the migrant for some share of the benefits that they obtain from migrating to their country, trying to unite the economic interests of the working classes of wealthy and of poor countries, and to encourage much larger scale migration thereby. Fourth, we argue that antitrust policy has a huge potential, but the reason why it has been largely ineffective thus far is because it's focused on a tiny minority of the set of things that are creating market power in our economy. In particular, it's completely ignored, number one, the power of institutional investors like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, which own about 25% of the corporate economy and are the largest 5 shareholders of about 70% of companies, and therefore have no interest in seeing any of those companies that should be competing with each other compete either for consumers or workers or in the political sphere, leading to a dramatic rise in market power in the economy. And second, it ignores what we believe is a far greater source of market power than is market power over consumers, which is market power over workers. Because most people have many more choices of products that they would like to buy. Like, I could probably find 7 clickers that are just as good as this, but far fewer choices of where they work. And yet there's been no enforcement of antitrust against employers' power. And finally, we argue that the data that you and I every day contribute to platforms like Facebook and Google, and that is training the algorithms that those companies use to eventually displace our jobs, is in fact our work. It's sort of as if we had a system where rather than creating movies and having unions defending the people who work there and them getting credits and getting paid, we went out and we just videotaped people on the street and used that to replace all the people in the theater. And then everyone said, oh, the camera is replacing the theater. No humans are ever going to have jobs in the theater anymore. That's effectively what all this AI stuff is doing. It's just taking all of our data, it's mashing up that data, and then it's serving it back to us as some magical thing that the computer did. When in fact, the computer learned everything from the data that we're supplying to it all the time. And you can imagine all the reasons why that situation in the movies would be terrible. You'd have awful movies, and the income distribution would be far more inequitable, and people would have a sense that like humans aren't interesting anymore, and the only thing that's interesting is the camera itself, right? And so all those things are going wrong with our data economy. People don't have a sense of dignity. There's a huge capital share in these industries, and we're getting bad quality advancements in AI because we're not actually paying the people who are creating the value there. So we advocate the creation of data labor unions to fix this situation and to create a real market in consumer data. And today actually was the creation of the first registered data labor union in the Netherlands under Dutch labor law. Okay, so just to wrap up, we argue that together these ideas would grow the economy by 1/3 while reducing inequality near permanently to the levels that it had mid-century. Because it would diffuse wealth sort of permanently, it would sort of abolish the capital-labor distinction. It would double the median income in that process while only reducing the income accruing to the top 1% or the effective income by about 1/4. But maybe beyond its economic effects, socially, it would reconcile the people who feel most left behind by globalization, technology, immigration, to those things and actually make them the largest constituency for that sort of progress. And in the process would heal the divide between the poor and the rich world by making far greater opportunities available to the people in the poor world and allowing the middle classes of the wealthy world to benefit from that. So while these are very radical solutions, we actually believe that unlike the other solutions that are being proposed, many of them more timid, they're actually feasible. They're actually politically, at some level, in the medium term feasible, and they are economically feasible, unlike these other solutions. And yet, they don't exhaust the benefits that we could get from this type of ideas because each one is meant to be implementable and desirable unilaterally. But when you combine them together, there's huge synergies between them that could go, I think, probably significantly beyond the benefits that they have unilaterally. But in order to get there, we need these ideas to be developed further. We need them to be conveyed in a broader range of ways. We need people to experiment with them and find the flaws and improve on those flaws and propose other ideas that have this sort of a spirit that can move us forward. And for that we need artists and entrepreneurs and statesmen. And I hope some of you in this room will end up being some of those. So, thanks.